We could actually spend 2 or 3 years teaching you how to operate in an actual contest situation. There's that much strategy that can be learned. And if you're going to actually be in a contest, should you master the strategy? If you're going to accomplish anything, you've got to master that strategy or you can't make it. Now, why don't we teach any strategy in this seminar? Well, we're assuming that we're going to do what with all the contests? Eliminate it. In other words, we do not want to fight. When I have a supplier that wants to fight, that just tells me one thing. That's the last thing I buy from him. But you can tell where contest is. And what you should do the minute you run into contest is avoid it as fast as you can. Move away from it, wherever it is. If you've got an employee that's in contest, terminate him. Make it very simple. I had an actual case history this week in a management consulting case. A man decided that he would come to work when he wanted to. When he wanted to take a break, he would punch out when he felt like it. The supervisor didn't know what to do. He went to his boss, and he told his boss, and his boss says, have him come in and see me. He came in, and he says, we want you to do this and do this. Are you going to do it? And he said, no, I'm going to do it this way. Did he waste another word? Picked up the telephone, didn't even answer him. Picked up the telephone, called payroll. Says, I'd like to have a check for so-and-so in 5 minutes for 2 weeks pay in advance. It's kind of shock to this guy. He's getting ready for his war. He wants to fight. How can he fight now? Can you fight this company? No, they don't believe in fighting. His check's handed to him and he leaves. They shut the door. We stopped it right now. It's that simple. Now I want us to see tonight that can we, by very minute things, determine whether we have trust or not. All right, now let's bring it real close to home. Here's a husband and a wife. And he suggests that they should do it this way. And she said, well, I don't really know if that's the best way. Or he says, I think it's about 3 miles to that town. She says, no, it's 3.2. Or another way, I think it's a long ways to that next town. I don't think it's that far. Now I'm using a situation where we don't even know what he's talking about. In other words, these little words infer what? Well, whatever you said, I know one thing, I don't quite agree with you, even if I do not understand what you're trying to say. Now, to put this in contrast, when I'm in a role relationship, if I say, it's a long ways to that next town, what does she say? Yeah, I think it's a long ways. She tends to do what? Reinforce the direction that you're going. Then do you have to exaggerate? No, then you don't have to say. You just say it's a good distance to the next town. But if she's going to pull back halfway of what you say, then you're going to say it's twice that far, even more than you think, are you not? Now, the minute I've done that, have I got a contest? What causes people to exaggerate? Because they have been around contestants for so long that have cut what they've said in half that they figure out the only way I can get what I want across is to say it double, then let them cut it in half and we'll have it about right. Now, under role relationship, shouldn't you be able to say exactly what you say and they should say they think that's right? Now, you can feel these little tiny resistances when a 5-year-old boy says why. You have a role relationship with that boy. You know, in my books, when a 5-year-old boy says why, that's grounds for a spanking. Because I interpret that why as open rebellion. In other words, you come home and you say, clean your room. And he says, why? Now what if you, in good faith, would sit down and give him a 15-minute lecture on why it should be clean? And then he goes ahead and cleans it. Do you have a role relationship? He's cleaning it for what purpose? Well, you have convinced his intellect by good, sound logic, haven't you? So what's his motive in cleaning the room? The good, sound logic is their obedience. You say, well, he didn't talk back. He cleaned it. Yes, he talked back when he said why. In In other words, we say in role relationship, does the female do what the male says without knowing why? Now, I realize if the male wants to go ahead and explain the reasons why, that's his prerogative, but does he have to? Think of a situation when the male role is trying to get something done, and one of the elements that we talked about that's in the way is time. Should he be able to come out and say this, this, this? And should the female roles know this is ridiculous, this is absurd, and this is impossible? And what should they do? Do it. There's no question about it. Now, does he have time to sit down for 2 hours and tell him, now this is the reason this has to be done. If you don't do this, the ship will sink. And while he's finishing up the final details of explaining it, they're getting the life raft out. And the man says, well, you should have told me it was that urgent. Does the male role even have to say it's that urgent? No. I'm trying to portray an image tonight of real efficiency and real productivity where the male role can carry out a definite plan of action. Now, should he really be allowed this much freedom? Well, you know, if he doesn't make it, who hangs? The female roles don't hang. When the guy's business finally goes under, the employees just sort of smile. Tough. But the owner has to go talk with the bankers. In other words, when it's finally said and done, does the male role really have the responsibility? We've gone over this over and over. There's no question about it. The male role has a responsibility. Is it fair to give him total responsibility without total authority? This is one reason why I believe American men are actually pulling back from assuming responsibility. Why should you possibly want the responsibility without any authority? Think of it for a moment tonight. Would you really want to move in and accept all the responsibility if you really couldn't carry forth a plan of action? If every time you turned around, something blocked you, would you feel like assuming responsibility? No. Right now, what I have to have tonight, if I'm going to take over an organization, and I'm going to be solely responsible for this organization, I want how much freedom to run it? Complete freedom. And there's no other way that I'll accept it. We can plug in every type of relationship underneath the sun. Teacher here, student here. This is interesting in a teacher-student relationship. The goal here is to learn. If the student is not submissive, we said if you're not submissive, do you lose productivity? Yes. Right? In other words, if a student is rebellious, do they learn? No. Now, most of our colleges today have set up a competition and an actual contest between professor and student. What have we done to the actual learning process? Lowered the chances of increasing the knowledge of the students. You could have a pilot, stewardess, passenger. Let's take an illustration of a ship. When a ship goes down, who's the last one to come off? There's your male role. Does he know that when he takes his license to be a captain? He knows I'm going to play the male role and everybody else goes off of this ship before I do, because who carries the full weight of the responsibility? That captain. Why don't you let your mind ramble tonight through every relationship you can think of underneath the sun, and can you plug them in male, female? Now, if you understand the principle of role relationship, can you figure out the relationship then? Then each of you know what your function is in the relationship, then you've solved the contest and the conflict. All right? Now, an interesting thing for you to do would be able to discover when am I playing a male role and when am I playing a female role. And I have a formula tonight that can actually show us which position we're in. Now, this is the affectional field diagram with my Y and X axis. At the very top in the positive aura will be affection. At the very bottom of a negative syndrome will be indifference. I'm going to put a continuum of both the male role and the female role. Obviously, when I go below the x-axis, I'm in a contest. And above the x-axis, I'm in role relationship. Clear down at the bottom of the male role will be a feeling of blaming. Just as quick as I pass an x-axis in a role relationship playing the male role, I start blaming. And just as fast as I cross the x-axis in the female role, I start nagging or judging or complaining. Because I'm doing what? I'm pulling a judge role. Now, the role relationship is not destroyed until both people go below the x-axis. You can actually have one person to the role relationship below the line and still have role relationship, such as this. From points A to points B. All right, if the male role is above the line at point A and the female is below the line at point B, I still have a role relationship. Both parties have to be below the x-axis before I will dissolve the relationship. Now, what will happen? At the top of the male role will be responsibility. And at the top of the female role will be submission. Now, we're saying then that how do I show love? This is, I think, extremely important. It's not enough to say I love you. In fact, it gets kind of sickening. People rebel at that. Have you heard a lady turn around and tell him, I'm tired of words? You don't just say, it's a feeble attempt to just keep saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, and as if the number of times is going to help the situation. It won't. But what if I know how to show love? How does a male show love? Only one way. Assuming responsibility. If you really want to show your wife you love her, you should find every responsible act you could possibly find. Just search for responsibility, and every time you find it, embrace it. Now, how does a woman show she loves her husband? Not by cooking. Not even a love affair will do it. This is not the way you go about it. You go at it simply by finding out what in the world he wants. What's his desires? What's his opinions? What's his wishes? And you satisfy them. We say then that she shows love by submission. Now, if I should be playing the male role and I'm blaming something, and then am I conscious that I'm making a mistake? I'd like to give you an actual illustration that happened to me about 3 years ago. Anything that happened to me more than 3 years ago, I can talk about. That's far enough away that it doesn't hurt anymore. 3 years ago, I was mowing the lawn. Now, the grass, I would say, was 6 inches tall. And it was one of these seesaw battles, back and forth, and then rake job, and then some more seesaw. And I had blamed the lawnmower. It didn't cut good. I blamed the basket because it wouldn't hold enough grass. I blamed the rain because it rained so much I couldn't get in to cut it sooner. The fertilizer was blamed for a few minutes because it was making it grow too fast. I think I spent 2 hours blaming everything physical around. How do you feel when you blame something physical? It's kind of cheap, isn't it? I mean, after I blame it, I realize the lawnmower can't help it. That's why I keep blaming other things, because nothing can stand up to hold the responsibility. So I'm exhausted from blaming everything, kind of exasperated, tired. My wife sees that I need a little help. So she comes walking out across the lawn with a glass of cold water. Now, has she done anything very seriously wrong here? All right, I look up at her before I even had control of myself. I say, why didn't you tell me this grass was this long? Now, let me interpret what I said a different way. What I really said was, would you please nag at me from now on? Didn't I? Did you know that when a woman nags, it's normally because she was asked to? So, my wife has a choice. She's up here, by the way. I'm asking her to do what? She's at the top of the arrow at submission. And I'm asking her to do what? Drop all the way into a negative syndrome and nag. She happens to like it, where she's showing love and a lot of submission, and she doesn't want to leave. So she makes a remark that I'll never forget as long as I live. She said, I thought I would let the grass do the talking. I moved from blame to responsibility instantly. I never blamed anybody or anything since for lawns. Now, I know I have been trained. I know I have grown up. I know I have matured in this area. I have been driving along in the city, not conscious of lawns, and yet you can ask me if there were any lawns that needed cutting in the block we just passed, and I can tell you. In other words, have I grown up? People ask me all the time, how do you get your husbands to grow up? What's the secret to make an immature husband grow up? Submission. In other words, I grew up instantly because she was submissive. Why? When she says I'm here at submission, I have to be there at responsibility. If I'm anything else, am I a heel? So I grew up. Now, what if she didn't do that to me? What if she'd have said, well, if you want me to nag, I will. Would I have had to check the length of the grass again? No. I would come home, it could even be dark. And I would hear her and she would say, it's time to cut the lawn. I'd listen to the decibels, the intensity, and I'd say, it's 1 3/4 inches long. Would I cut it? Of course not. Doesn't need cutting when it's only that long. Next week I'd come in and her voice would be different. Who's training her to sound off so that you can measure the length of grass by the tone of the voice? I would be training her to do this. In other words, it's a method where I don't have to check the faucet to find out how bad the leak is. There's a screen banging. Do I have to check it? No, I can only listen and I can tell. Sure enough, the intensity's right, the decibels are right, that grass is 2.5 inches tall. So I get out the next day and cut it. Is this how you want it to be? Or would you like to assume the responsibility and not have her nag? By the way, should a wife even have to tell you to fix a leaky faucet? No. A man who's going to run a good ship should keep it in ship shape without someone announcing night and day what's the new duties. If a husband wants a wife to make suggestions, then she has to be submissive. If he doesn't want her to make suggestions, then she will not make them in order to be submissive. Submission is not something I can define tonight for you, because submission is completely related to the male's desires. Some husbands might want one thing, other husbands might want other things, and whatever they want, that's what submission is. And some husbands might want the wife to cut the grass. Then that's submission. I mean, then she gets out and cuts it. We can't define tonight what duties make up submission and which ones do not. But a wife who wants to be submissive, she'll learn her husband backwards and forwards, and she'll know what he wants. And then she'll do this. And there's a tendency when either partner are at the top of the positive aura for the other one to go there too. I mean, it's just normal for you to want to do that. But you can have all kinds of relationships. I could have one from point D to point E. Or I could have one from point A to point F. Normally, the person who is the highest in the positive aura cares more about the relationship. I mean, to them it's more precious, more valuable, and they're probably receiving greater rewards from the relationship. I think I can explain this so that you'll grasp it by an actual illustration. If I had a particular job to do, and I had a man hired to do it, and it was a deadline, and just before the deadline was up, he came and told me he couldn't do it. And I would tell him that you should have come sooner. I could tell him anything I wanted to tell him, but it won't do a bit of good. All I can do is fire him. Because he has no responsibility for the job at all. I have the responsibility for the job. I'm going to hire 3 crews, and they're going to work the next 2 days, day and night, to get it done. Does he walk out scot-free? And if I don't do the job, I won't have the income, and the bank who's playing the male role to me will do what when I don't pay the mortgage? Well, they'll say, well, you're not capable of running this, so we're going to take it away from you. This business is not for you. So in order for me to be submissive to the bank, I've got to do what? Run the business. But the man that I hired is not doing the job. So I terminate him. Well, all right, let's go what we lose. I lose a man, but I also lose a job, which I have to do anyway. The man only loses what? He can only lose a job. In other words, all he can possibly lose in a situation is his relationship with me. Then what can a wife lose? Only her relationship with her husband. What do children lose? Only the relationship with the parents. Always remember that the responsibility always stays with the male role. He loses not only the person, but he goes and picks up the tab on top of it. So here I am with the man I fired, going his merry way with his 2 weeks' pay, happy as a lark. What am I doing? Hustling around the country, hiring a crew, working night and day. Because do I have the responsibility? You know I feel it. Let's carry it up the chain of command. What if I decide to walk down the road and sing a happy song too? The bank's in there doing it. In other words, if you wanted to carry this to its extreme, all responsibility lies in God. Does this make sense? There is no responsibility on the face of this earth apart from God. All the rest of our responsibilities is in our relationships alone. And what you lose is your relationship. Now it happens that our relationships are very valuable to us. So we tend to please our Lord and Master, and we should use those words tonight so you get used to them. Because the female role, what is the male role to her? It has to be a Lord and Master. This is the only kind of relationship that works. But I think you'll enjoy this formula because it allows you to determine your roles. And by the way, you are always playing a male or a female role at all times. And this is good to know how to do it. If the male role were properly played, we would not even have society there at all. You wouldn't have a union if management had played the male role correctly. Would you ever have a divorce if a husband played his role correctly? Would children ever leave a home if the parents played their role correctly? Therefore, we're going back to the same thing we've gone back to over and over this evening. It's that male role that has full responsibility. All right, let's go into the chain of command next. And this will be a fascinating subject, and it will help explain the theory. We're going to have a doctor, a nurse, and a patient. We're going to have a ROTC lieutenant. He's a second lieutenant normally. Underneath him will be a warrant officer, master sergeant. This is a man who has been an officer but who's retired to enlisted status in order to receive more money. It was something that the United States did after World War II to reduce the budget for officers but increase the budget for enlisted men. Under the master sergeant is the private. We have a husband, wife, children. We have a pilot, a stewardess, and a passenger. Now, any of those that we have on the board, we can put in a definite chain of command. We say that the nurse is playing the female role to the doctor and the male role to the patient. Now let's look at some complications that we can have here, and let's take our ROTC lieutenant. He doesn't know quite everything, does he? But he happens to be in a situation where he's giving orders to the warrant officer, who's now a master sergeant. And he gives an order that the master sergeant knows is wrong. There's no question about it in his mind. It's a clear-cut case. The lieutenant is definitely wrong. The master sergeant does what? He submits to the system. He carries out the orders even though he knows that they are wrong. By the way, the lieutenant was taught to make a decision even if it were wrong. You say, well, why would they do that? Well, the Army has found out a wonderful thing, that if you make no decision, you lose more lives than if you make a wrong one. Therefore, a wrong one's a right one. And if the warrant officer should decide to take half the men and go the right way, would they lose more lives than if you took all the men and went the wrong way? So really then, is a wrong decision a right one? I'm trying to show you tonight that the system is more important than being right. Since the warrant officer was submissive to the lieutenant, what does the private do? He has watched the warrant officer or the master sergeant, and he, by example, knows that even though the master sergeant is wrong, what do? I obey him. Therefore, do we have a unity that will run an entire system and give it order? If the warrant officer should decide that the lieutenant's all wrong, then the private won't obey the warrant officer. Then my whole system crumbles and I lose the war. Plus, there's something wonderful, because on top of the ROTC lieutenant's a captain. Now, he might be an alcoholic. You say, does this help the situation? Sure, because above the captain's a major. And above the major is a lieutenant colonel, and then a colonel, and then a general. I am getting security because I know each man is submissive to the man above him. So is it safe to trust the system? Let's take an actual situation. Here's a husband who tells his wife, I want you and the children to do this today while I'm gone. And he gets in his car and drives out of town. The wife takes one look and she says, this is ridiculous. She remembers what's more important, to do something ridiculous and obey the system, or to be clever. I'm giving you an actual case history of a woman who attended a seminar and she decided the system was more important. So can you see her with those children doing this ridiculous thing all day? Junior says, Mom, do you understand what we're doing? She says, I don't understand a thing. Dad said to do it, we're doing it. Finally, the other little kid says, I think it's all wrong, Mom. I really do. We're thinking about it for 3 hours now. I think we better quit. Mom says, nope, this is what he wants done, this is what we're doing. He comes home that night. He looks at it and he says, why on earth did all of you waste your time today doing this? We have to do it all over again. This is ridiculous. She says, you told us to. She said the interesting thing happened when she said that. He never said a word. She was wondering, how this was going to work out. She said that he was real quiet for almost 2 weeks. She says he was just afraid to open his mouth. She said he was really thinking. Finally, he'd thought some things through and he'd give them some orders. She said since that day, he's never said another ridiculous thing. She says his words really count now. Did she cause him to grow up overnight? Now, it wasn't too long after that, she asked one of her children to do something, and it was ridiculous. But she didn't know it at the time, the child did it. She says, now I know how my husband felt. In other words, she says, I have learned before I tell the children anything to think it through. Have we taught them that the system is more important, they have law and order, and that have we caused maturity in the male role? Now this is interesting because is it possible for the wife to know more than the husband? She might have more education. She might read a book while he's at work. She might watch something on TV. I mean, there's all kinds of ways for her to learn more than him. If she's a clever wife, what will she do with this knowledge?